Well, thank you to the our final roundtable panel, and we saved the best for last, even though they were all good. And I've been excited about this panel, and the reason is, as I said earlier in the beginning of the morning, I got involved with this issue back in 2002, 2003. Thank you. And in 2007, we put on an all-day conference, and even some of the participants that we had to date were there in 2007. And then we did it again in 2010 and had a great conference. And I think that moved the needle along to get AB 2503 in and get that adopted and signed into law. The only problem, it never got implemented. And that was pretty much a reefing legislation that allowed for platforms to be cut off 85 feet and reefed. And it had a lot of aspects to it, but we thought we'd go back and do fix-it legislation. Never happened. And so here we are in 2022 when we started this in 2007, and we're talking about it again in the same subject. So kind of that tells you we haven't made a lot of progress since 2007. And yet the problem is getting worse. And you know, a couple things that back in 2007, 2010, when we had these meetings, we were talking 50 million, 75 million, maybe 150 million. Now the numbers start at 300, 400 million and go up from there. And so it's become a lot more costly, and there's much more money involved. Back then, we were still arguing over, do platforms provide a viable habitat? Are they productive reefs? And that was a debate. And I think there's enough science that's been settled. And you heard our professors this morning pretty much answer that question. And so there is, and when you have, on a worldwide basis, depleting fish populations and you have productive reefs, you know, you've got to balance out the issue of, you know, what do you take out, what do you keep? And so these are all questions, but what the goal I'm seeing and what I would love today is to end this educational day, and with this panel, we have the right people here, and to come up with one or two or maybe three action items that we can carry forward. And as Chad said earlier, Chad Nelson from Surfrider said earlier, you know, it's going to be up to the NGOs and the community-based organizations to keep this conversation going. You know, after we got the bill adopted in 2011-12, we just thought we'd fix that and go ahead. Obviously, the conversation went dormant, so we can't afford to. And we had the October 1st bill. I thought that was a great opportunity to reignite this conversation. Interesting thing that you may not realize is that there's been a lot of scrutiny on the quality of water, oil sheens off Huntington Beach. And even though the whole world heard on October 1st there was an oil spill, there's been 5 incidents of oil sheens on top of the surface since then. And one was tied to a pinhole leak in a pump on a platform. One was tied to a pipe. And so are we just learning that because we're paying more attention? Or has that been a commonplace? We don't know. But, you know, there's a lot that can be done, and we've been quiet for 10 years. So now, you know, we want people here to be engaged. We want people to add a voice. You know, we want the surfing community, the sport fishing community, all the rest of the stakeholders to acquire a voice and get involved. And we'll be there cheering everybody on and trying to give some guidance. But anyhow, 2 of our panelists today you've already have introduced and you've heard, and we're delighted they're here. But we have Senator Dave Menn and Assemblyman Connie Petrie Norris. And And rather than me go through a introduction, I even prepared one, I just want you to introduce yourself. You say what you want.
Ladies first?
Oh,
You go
go
first,
first.
Senator.
My name is Dave Menn. I have the pleasure of serving the 37th Senate District as representative. I was elected in 2020, and before that I was a UC Irvine law professor teaching contracts and banking. I was a former Hill staffer around economic policy. And climate change has been a top concern of mine since getting elected. I have the privilege of representing Irvine, my home city, as well as Newport, Laguna, about half of Huntington, the half of Huntington that was most affected by the oil spill, and then, of course, some inland territories like Costa Mesa, Tustin, Lake Forest, Orange, Villa Park, Anaheim Hills, and some others. And, I think offshore drilling was not at the top of my to-do list prior to the oil spill, but I think Assemblywoman Petrie-Norris and I think we're both immediately struck by the devastation to our ecosystems, our economies. And one of the points I have continually made is that with a $44 billion coastal economy in California each year, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have offshore rigs that are and I may be editorializing a little bit, but that are aging in infrastructure, that are likely to have future spills and problems. Even if you don't believe that climate change is the existential threat that I believe it is, the basic math doesn't add up. And so I think it's about time we started phasing these out. And I think we have an interesting approach, one we're working closely with WISPA and others on. We're engaging with stakeholders, and one that we hope we can land. But I guess that's TBD.
Connie.
Well, hi, everybody. Good afternoon, and thank you, Gary, for including me in today's conversation. I am Assemblywoman Petrie-Norris, and I represent the 74th Assembly District, which includes the city of Newport Beach, as well as Huntington Beach, Laguna Beach, Irvine, Costa Mesa, and Laguna Woods. So, like Dave, I represent the community that was so impacted by the October oil spill. And I know for so many of us, that spill really was our worst fears come to life. And it was heartbreaking for us to see oiled wildlife on the shores of these beaches that we are lucky enough to call our home. And I know for me, so I think Dave had said, sort of offshore oil drilling wasn't at the top of the list. And it wasn't for me either, but it's interesting in kind of reflecting back. One of the reasons I actually decided to run for office and to run for this seat initially was based on the perspective of the previous assembly member. When Donald Trump had announced that he was expanding offshore oil drilling off the coast of California. And I'm sure many of you and thousands of our neighbors and fellow residents, we gathered on beaches up and down the coast to protest that, to hold hands against that. And actually the previous occupant of this office was full-throated in support for doing that. And that was really one of the tipping points for me in deciding to run for office. And I have then found it astonishing and totally heartbreaking to be in a situation where it wasn't this abstract threat. It was very real, and it was happening in my community. And I found it to be a tremendous thing, but both honor, privilege, and also responsibility now serving in this office, I think, like Dave, to recognize, we aren't going to let another disaster like this happen on our watch here in our communities. We are going to do everything that we can, both to prevent oil spills from happening, to improve our response to mitigate the damage, but ultimately, I think we all recognize that the fundamental lesson of this spill is really easy, right? When there's drilling, there's spilling, and it's incumbent upon all of us to, again, for all the reasons, Dave, that you articulated, that we end offshore drilling off of our coast. And so I know that I am committed to that, as is Senator Menn. I think we also recognize, as everyone in this room does, there's no silver bullet, right? There's no magic wand that we can just wave and send those rigs away. So as much as we might like to, we instead are going to dive into the much tougher conversation of how do we phase out production and how do we ultimately decommission those rigs. So really looking forward to this conversation, and hopefully, as you said, Gary, emerging from this with some concrete action items that we can all work together on.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, you have the glorious position of being responsible if something goes wrong. Or if an oil operator, if an operator goes bankrupt, and you've got to be on the doorsteps to take over. What do you see from your standpoint, your perspective of being the one that has to step in and take over? What do you see you feel we need that we don't have?
That is a great question, and I wish we could rewind time and set our laws a little bit differently, because there's a lot of things in our legal and policy framework that create just real challenges and obstacles, especially when an operator falls into bankruptcy. So it was just a short 6 years ago when Veneco essentially quitclaimed their leases to the State Lands Commission and filed for bankruptcy that afternoon. And we were given just essentially weeks' notice that was a possibility and days' notice before it was an actuality. And so what that meant for us as a state is we had to mobilize very quickly to make sure that we had staff on the platforms and on the processing facilities, because these platforms have to be operated and maintained 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, especially Platform Holly, which has very high concentrations of hydrogen sulfide gas, which can be lethal at relatively small concentrations. And so just from a logistics standpoint, we had to mobilize, the state had to mobilize very quickly just to staff the facilities. And then it was, all hands on deck. The community was scared about what was happening and unfolding right in their backyard, and that was something that we felt very acutely. There was a lot of education and conversations happening with the communities affected by this, and we had to be very open and honest that we didn't know exactly how everything was going to play out because the state had never been in this situation before. We had to position ourselves legally to engage and fight for the state in the federal bankruptcy actions. We also had to move relatively quickly on trying to figure out how to get state funding, because we aren't funded for this type of operation, how to get emergency funding, how to get the bond proceeds, and then how to set up the whole framework for starting to plug and abandon and decommission these facilities. The one thing that the law provides is once a lessee or operator in state waters claims their leases, sends their leases back to the state, gives up all of their rights under that lease document, the state is prohibited from releasing for new oil and gas purposes, production purposes. And that was a policy decision, and a good one, that was made in the 1990s. But what that also set up is the state has very little time in a situation to react and plan accordingly. And so I think with Senator Minn's leadership, Assemblymember Petrie Norris, and Assemblymember Borner Horvath, there's legislative efforts now to try to set us up so that we can be more proactive and thoughtful in how we approach decommissioning and dealing with an industry where all of the majors have moved out of California, and we're dealing with, we have some really solidly positioned operators that are currently operating the platforms, but that can change in an instant. And so we want to make sure that we're positioned properly to be able to adapt and react appropriately.
Okay, great. Senator Minn, you have a solution.
I do, yeah.
Would love to hear about it.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you, Gary. And so I guess some of you may have seen that in the aftermath of the oil spill, I pledged that I would introduce legislation to end offshore drilling in state waters. And that is what our bill, which is currently going to go to its first committee next week, Natural Resources, purports to do. And so we've been working closely with Lands Commission, with environmental groups like Coastkeeper, NRDC, Center for Biological Diversity, Sierra Club, EcoVote, and others, as well as with the operators with the Western State Petroleum Association and other trade groups to try to find the right solution. And I think I'd start by just saying, the reality is that if we are going to try to end these operations, to end this drilling, we do have to pay the operators. That is just a non-starter under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. We have to make a payment. It's just compensation. It is eminent domain. Any first-year con law student can tell you that that's required. The question is how we go about doing that. So in consultation with Lands, the approach we came up with was kind of a three-step approach. It's still something that's a work in progress, but the first step is to give Lands Commission some period of time under the leadership of what's your title, by the way? Executive Officer Lucchese. It's a mouthful.
Yes, Jennifer is fine.
The Honorable Lucchese, that we would have them conduct an amortization study to determine what's required here, what is the fair market value that we should be paying out to these operators. And when I say that, it's not just about the present value of future revenue streams, but also the cost of decommissioning. Because that's something that, as Executive Officer Lucchese pointed out, was missing with the operators of Platform Holly. It's something we want to incorporate. So when we talk about fair market value, it's not just what you're going to make, it's also the liabilities you're going to incur. So what's the total all-in cost of that? We want this process to be fair and transparent and in consultation with the operators and with groups like WISPA. But we, at this point, contemplate 1 year to have Lands Commission conduct that study, then another year to negotiate a voluntary settlement with the two operators of the three platforms that are in state waters, see if they can come to a deal based on what they've determined is the fair value. And if they can't do that after a year, then after 2 years after the date the legislation goes into effect, the idea is that they shall terminate those leases, and they have the authority to do that. They have the authority to provide just compensation based on their determination of what that is to end those leases at a time they determine appropriate. So that's the structure right now. As I mentioned, it is a bit in flux right now. We're still negotiating to see if we can get people in a better place as far as the politics of this. And I will say the politics are very tricky because a bill like this has a lot of different stakeholders. But I think that's the approach. It's one we feel like is fair. It gets to the goal of ending offshore drilling in state waters at a date certain. And we hope that it will set a precedent for the federal government to follow. So there's 28 platforms right now in state and federal waters. There are 4 in state waters, Platform Holly plus 3 others. There are 24 in federal waters. We can't touch those as a state legislature, but we have been talking with Congress members Mike Levin, Katie Porter, and others about our approach, and we hope that they might consider emulating it if we're able to get this through the legislature here. So I guess that's the sort of high-level approach, and happy to talk more about some of the details.
Thank you. Thank you. Catherine, you've been involved in this for a long time, like all of us have, but you probably have been involved with it longer. And the oil companies, the big guys pretty much got out of operation, and now, they may be buried down in some leases as far as responsibility, but they're not operating. It seems like the oil companies haven't really told us their total concern on liability, but they're not happy with anything they've seen in legislation or proposed or in 2503. They're not happy with where we're headed from my understanding, but yet I haven't heard exactly what they want.
Yeah, thank you, Gary. And first of all, welcome, Senator, and welcome, Assemblywoman. Great to have you both. We've been having a great day here, talking about many things. And I would first just say that I agree, Senator, with with both of you, and I think your comment, Assemblywoman, that there's no silver bullet. Right? This is complicated, and to the reference the Senator made on climate change, it is even more complicated because we talked earlier about the fact that our industry is still required by the governor, by this legislature, by both of you and your colleagues to supply the demand of California consumers today, tomorrow, and for the foreseeable future. So that comes from crude oil. Now, it's transitioning, and we're involved in all of that, and we're all very much invested in it and the innovation that comes with it. But for the foreseeable future, we've got to wrestle with the fact, and we made a lot of participants said we have to, look at the facts, look at the science. And so it's not just the fact that we will be, eventually getting out of oil production in this state vis-a-vis the suggestions that you're both making, but there is also a very concerted effort to stop all oil production onshore. And so what I struggle with, and I mentioned earlier what I struggle with, is we still have got to get crude oil from somewhere, and as you know, we have no pipelines that bring it here. And so we either produce it here under the strictest environmental regs in the world, or we have to import it from foreign sources, which is basically Saudi Arabia, Colombia, Iraq, Venezuela, a little bit from Russia, not exactly places that I don't think anyone's particularly comfortable for us to put all our eggs in that basket. So it is a conversation today about offshore, but it's also a conversation that you all and us and everyone will have to wrestle with in the transition of where we are and where we're going. And so we talked earlier about, whatever we do in this bill or other bills, make sure we have that conversation about a business proposition that is attractive so that these companies can have options and choices to evaluate. And I think one thing I fear is that we focus so much on complete decommissioning that the other options are not viable ones on the table. And I just think there's such excitement around what those options are, whether it's rigs to reef or other repurposing we talked about today, wind energy, research for aquaculture, whatever. It just seems that I hope we can get to a place that it allows these companies to make actually be able to evaluate those choices, because it's a real option on the table. And liability, Garry, to your point, is a very big one on that.
Okay, thank you. Assemblywoman, after the October oil spill, you were appointed to be the chairman of the Assembly's Select Committee on the Huntington Beach oil spill, and you have had 2 hearings. That was kind of a crash course in all of this, and I'd be interested in what's your take on where we are and what we need to do?
So we conducted 2 hearings. In November, we had a hearing that was really focused on prevention, cleanup, prevention, and response. And then in January, we had a hearing. Actually, Ms. Lucchese joined us for a hearing focused on decommissioning. And I guess my takeaways, sort of big picture. I guess the bad news. I guess the bad news everyone in this room already knows. So our decommissioning hearing. I think a lot of people expected to be told by you, Ms. Lucchese, and others. Okay, here's the answer. We're going to do this, and it'll take a month, and then it's done. And instead we were told, actually, no. The state cannot simply, say that we are going to unilaterally ban oil production on these rigs. We cannot unilaterally end leases, which is why I think we've got the approach that Senator Min is now taking, and the approach on the Assembly side kind of coming out of that hearing. And my colleague Tasha Burner-Horvath and I are working on something that is somewhat similar. I think it's a little bit of a different structure, but a similar really request of state lands to develop a plan and a strategy for what would it look like for us to phase out offshore production and how much would it cost. So that's that's the bad news. I think the good news is kind of in the interim, as we look at where there are opportunities for us to do a better job at preventing oil spills, better responding to spills. When we had that hearing, I wasn't sure if we were going to come away with very much, honestly, and we actually did. And there's a number of things that we can do and that we are working towards on that front, and a number of those things have actually turned into legislation, including just better preparedness for our local communities, ensuring that every coastal community has an oil spill response unit. I know what it's called, not unit. You know what I'm talking about. An oil spill response vessel, and because the city of Huntington Beach, it was kind of happenstance that they had that to begin with. The Huntington Beach fire chief had said a couple months before, there's a state grant where we can apply for something so we can get our own oil spill cleanup equipment. They applied. They had literally gotten that equipment a month in advance. Had they not, the damage to Huntington Beach, the damage to our sensitive habitat, wetlands, wildlife would have been so much worse. So we were, hesitate to use the word lucky, but we were relatively lucky there. We cannot just assume that we can't rely on luck across the state. So ensuring that all of our coastal communities have those resources is important. There's also things that we can do to improve regulation and improve the inspection capabilities of the fire marshal. So, one example there is in current state law, and hopefully Ms. Lucchese can correct me if I'm getting my exact numbers wrong, but if a well is producing at something less than 20% of capacity, they're not subject to inspections by the state fire marshal. So there are some operators who are kind of producing just beneath that, and we're not actually inspecting those. So there's legislation by Assemblymember Bloom. I think Senator Lamone also has some legislation to strengthen that and to just ensure that for the production that is happening, that the inspections and the prevention steps that we're taking are robust. And I want to just quickly, before I turn back to you, Garry, kind of come back. I was taking a couple notes when Catherine was replying to your earlier question, and I think in my mind, and I don't think everyone decouples this, but I think it's important to decouple the conversation around offshore production and onshore production for a couple of reasons. So, we all know that offshore production accounts for it's 1/3% of overall production, and I think when we look at that both as as a contributor to energy production, but also as a contributor to our economy relative to the risk, that trade-off in my mind just does not make sense. And I know for many of us that trade-off does not make sense when we can compare that to the impact of shutting down our coastal economy here or in Santa Barbara or anywhere on the California coast for even a week. It's just the economics, quite outside of the environmental impacts, just don't make sense when we talk about the offshore production. So that for me is one reason that it's important to sort of decouple those conversations. And then second, I think when we talk about transition, I know you highlighted ensuring that we're making the business proposition attractive. And I do think it's important, and this is what I really love, Garry, about your approach. I think we have to find those opportunities where instead of us being at polar opposites and fighting, it's figuring out how can we somehow, in this very tough problem, align incentives and take some pragmatic and practical steps so that we can actually move the ball forward. Because I think until we're willing to do that, we're not going to make progress. And so I think that pragmatism is really, really critical for us to actually make progress. And I so appreciate that you've always taken that approach.
Thank you.
I don't actually think there's anything that I disagree with the Assemblywoman on.
Well, good. See, there we go.
We've heard a number of speakers today, and I'll just quote two. Robert Boyd said, we have no workable reefing process. And Chris Potter said, we need a decommissioning plan. And there was one put into law 10 years ago, 2503, AB 2503, and it's set on a shelf. It's been referred to a lot today, but it for all practical purposes, it really doesn't exist. Would it be good to take a look at fixing it and seeing where the problems are, where it can be fixed, and the time frames, the liability, other issues? Or do we just scrap it and start over? I think that's kind of an 800-pound gorilla question, because everybody knows about it, people refer to it, but it's a dormant law sitting on a shelf. And do we just forget about it, or do we come up with a better plan? Who wants to take that on?
I think
First.
the Lands Commission.
None of you want to get out of it.
And the reason I say that is because they've learned. I understand you've learned a lot from your experience
Well,
in
yeah.
decommissioning platform Holly, and I think scaling that to other platforms, both in the state and then hopefully transferring that knowledge to the federal government. As I think you are well positioned.
I'm happy to start, but I am also not a policy maker. I'm a policy implementer, so I want to be very clear about that.
We need both.
Yes, we do, definitely. A couple things on the rigs to reef legislation. I think there's two fundamental distinctions in terms of the problems or the challenges with that legislation. There's a fundamental kind of value system and principle system that feeds into
Right.
what do communities want to see out there? Do they want to see everything removed, or do they place more value on the habitat that's there and that sort of thing? And so there's that fundamental value and principle question that needs to be addressed by our policymakers and our legislatures with information and perspective from the community. On the implementation side, there's also challenges with that law. And I think once you get the fundamental value system worked out, the implementation part is just trying to figure out what's going to be most efficient, what's going to be most effective. I will say from the science side of things and the technical feasibility and just the approach, we're going to see that put to work with Rincon Island and with Platform Holly. Those are two offshore facilities and operations that are not subject to 2503. They're not being approached under that framework, but certainly from the State Lands Commission side, we're approaching it from a feasibility perspective, and then through the environmental analysis, we're looking at it from the environmental impacts, and we're looking at all options from full removal to the entire structure staying in place and what kind of reuse opportunities there are and everything in between. And so we can see, I think we can use those two examples in terms of how something like a rigs to reef legislation would be implemented from a science and feasibility and on the ground perspective. Unfortunately, I have my own personal opinions that aren't appropriate or important here about kind of the fundamental value system associated with rigs to reef, but I think that's the bigger conversation and discussion that our policymakers have to have.
You should be a policy person.
No, whenever we get tough problems and we say, okay, we're going to write a bill that directs the State Lands Commission to figure this out for us.
If I may, our approach in SB 953 gives significant flexibility to Lands Commission to make those determinations in the voluntary agreement that they come to with the operators. And it just provides a date certain. Again, the dates we're talking about are things that are still subject to negotiation, discussion. But I think the idea here is, okay, if you can't come to an agreement, then we'll use something like a full cost of decommissioning calculus. But before that point, Lands Commission has flexibility to determine for itself, does the community want this to be converted to a windmill? Does it want it to be a rigs to reef type model? And in that framework of negotiation, we do allow for that to happen. So that certainly could be an outcome, and one we're hoping, because at the end of the day, there is always litigation risk if we do just say these leases are ended. We think the structure we've developed will survive that litigation risk, but we'd rather not test it out. There's only two companies here, and if Lands Commission can come to an agreement with them, that is the ideal outcome.
Catherine?
Again, I think I liked, Jennifer, how you phrased it, because it isn't a one-size-fits-all, right? It is important to understand what the communities and the stakeholders want to see happen. Because if you can't agree on that, then it makes it really difficult. But if you can agree on it, you find that common ground to start that conversation, then you are talking about implementation, right? So it's a much easier conversation. Today, we struggled with that, right? We struggled with everything from take it all out to the other options on the table. And I didn't hear a real consensus out of the day on that. So I do think, as you wrestle with this as the State Lands Commission, that getting that insight from the communities is going to be really important, because then you're just talking about the how, not the if, right? So I like that approach.
My views on rigs to reefs and what I've learned. Well, It's interesting. I think that there are folks in the environmental community who are strong supporters of rigs to reefs, and then there are folks who are vehemently opposed. And I think when we talk about stakeholders, those are the folks that are most likely to be engaged. And as I've kind of tried to unpack that and understand sort of what my assessments are, my understanding of 2503 is both the fact that one of the reasons that it has not been successful is because of the extended liability provisions, but also that indemnification element was incredibly important in the negotiations when they were happening, when that bill was first enacted. So I'm not sure how if that's the key challenge to why that hasn't been part of the solution, I don't know how we solve that specifically. And then I think my other and it's actually more of a question for folks here than it is an assertion, because my understanding is that the platforms that are in state waters, they're all about 85 feet, I believe. Is that right, in terms of depth? And so that those platforms are actually unlikely to even have rigs to reefs be a feasible solution. Some of the platforms, obviously, that are in federal waters, those are thousands of feet. So that is a different conversation. But in terms of the stuff that we actually collectively can move the needle on, my understanding is that rigs to reefs is not actually a solution that would be viable for the 3 platforms that are in state waters. And I'm curious if that is a correct or incorrect understanding.
I think Dr. Cleese is here. Maybe he could. Is Jeremy? Could you respond?
I'm asking. Yeah, I'm phoning a friend. for that question.
Some are deeper than 85. If you were going to cut it off at 85 feet, some are deeper. But because they're not that deep, you would be removing a substantial part of the habitat. So then it becomes an issue of what's left. And the real benefit in terms of maintaining a lot of the production is on the bigger platforms where you're taking out the small portion. You still have a lot of the habitat there. So you're right in that it becomes less of a cost-benefit analysis where the benefit's going to be large. And from what I've heard from the industry people, amount of cost of removing those smaller platforms completely is not, and the feasibility is not as challenging as
the larger.
ones.
Right. Yeah. So I think some of the strategies that have proven effective and successful in the Gulf or in Thailand or other parts of the world don't seem as relevant as points of comparison for at least the stuff that's in state waters, and then the stuff that's in federal waters is, I think, perhaps a different conversation is my sense.
I still would like to know what the formula was that Thailand and Africa and the Gulf figured out to do it, because we heard about that today as well, and it was like, okay, they figured it out. What are the lessons learned there? How did they come to terms with it so that they're actually doing it? I don't know the answer.
Right.
I just learned that today, by the way.
Are there any examples of offshore rigs that have been converted to windmills, offshore wind at this point, or?
That's a good question.
It's something that gets talked about. I just don't know. I've also heard people say it's feasible, not feasible, and I just don't know if there's any models.
That is a very good question.
There's been a lot of reuse ideas floated.
Discussions.
Everything from a marine laboratory with a coalition of universities to hydrostatic desal. And as we all know, the deeper you go, the more natural water pressures there. You get a system to the right depth, and naturally the pressure will push the salt water through the screens to take the salt out, and then you basically pump it up and pump it to shore. That's been, I think the number is 700 or 800 feet to get the right pressure to do that. But that's just one idea. There's a number of things floated.
May I add to that to answer your question a little bit more? Is we are currently processing 2 state applications for pilot offshore wind demonstration projects offshore Vandenberg.
Right.
And while I'm not sure about what has happened in the rest of the world in terms of putting actual turbines on platforms and generating energy from that, one of our applicants are proposing to tie into Platform Irene and use some of the infrastructure, the power cables and other infrastructure to help support their project so they don't have to put new infrastructure in. So there are like different levels and extent of reuse associated with like the whole offshore operation package.
Yeah, I think, Senator, your question is really well taken. I think there are operating and viable wind generation projects offshore. I don't know whether they have been put on a platform or they've just been put offshore and they're successful. And I would think that that would mean the possibility of putting it on offshore would be the same, right? It's just putting it on a structure, and they're putting it on structures now that are not offshore platforms.
Okay. We have questions that have been submitted throughout the day and in days prior. I'm just trying to go through them. And I guess a lot of them are more scientific than policy. I would, have there been any comprehensive assessments on the platforms to determine suitability for reefing or for alternative uses? Or does decommissioning process need to be initiated in order to start the assessment process with each individual platform? And
Yeah, well, in our experience, it's once once decommissioning has been triggered. We, as a state agency, we aren't funded to proactively assess that kind of opportunity on a programmatic level, but it is triggered when the operator or the state decides it's time to decommission, and so that's exactly what we're looking at. Not the traditional rigs to reef as contemplated in federal waters, but certainly reuse, habitat protection, habitat enhancement of the offshore structures, islands, and platform holly. So we'll be going through that process, through the feasibility study, and then through an environmental analysis.
okay.
So stay tuned. Watch this space.
Yes. And you said you're analyzing all the options.
Yes.
Which is great.
That's great.
I think we, Connie, I have a question for you on, when we were going through this before, it seemed like the big argument, and I said it earlier, the big argument was, are they productive reefs or not? And then it was, should they be taken out? Because that was the promises made years ago, and they put them in, they should pay to take it out. Since then, we've proven more of the science that shows there's a benefit for marine productivity. How do you see us balancing, or with what, or how do we balance that with public engagement to actually, what we're looking for is a direction forward and solutions?
How do we balance kind of what we know now versus what we know then,
Right.
in terms of enabling us to?
And the balance of, do we reef some because they're extremely viable habitats, or do we pretty much take the attitude, we'll take them all out unless they're, and how do we frame that for legislation? How do we frame that for public buy-in?
Well, I think, and Ms. Lucchesi referenced the fact there's going to be a comprehensive environmental impact study around Holly, which I think while that is certainly platform specific, and I think the analysis needs to be platform specific, my understanding is that there are going to be some good takeaways there that will be generalizable, I think, into our broader strategy. Again, not being an expert, but being a policymaker who's trying to pull information from experts, I don't think that reefing is going to prove viable for the 3 platforms in state waters.
Right.
But I think that there is an opportunity in federal waters, certainly, and I believe that should certainly be part of, I guess, the menu of solutions that we look at as we try to move forward. And I'm sure there's going to be, folks I know and maybe even here who get upset when they hear that, because I think there are certainly folks in the community and folks that
Right.
Dave and I serve with who think that it's a piece of metal in the ocean and that every single piece must go. But I don't know that that is actually a realistic destination. And so I think if we are in a fight about that, we're never going to make progress.
Dave, your legislation calls for the state coming up with some money to make this happen. One of the things we found is certainly the numbers are much, much higher than we thought not that many years ago.
Cost of decommissioning.
The cost of decommissioning.
Yep.
And the cost of monitoring wellheads, the cost of the sealing of wellheads.
Yeah.
How do you assess the public's acceptance or of being a part of paying the bill?
Yeah, so I guess maybe if I want to reframe your
Or
question.
you can reframe.
I think what you're asking is how do I justify the taxpayer paying for the oil companies to stop drilling, given the potentially exorbitant cost of decommissioning? And I guess I'd point to the example Platform Holly, which is an example where a thinly capitalized company walked away, declared bankruptcy, and left the taxpayer holding the bill.
Right.
Now, Lands Commission has been doing a great job under the leadership of Executive Officer Lucchese of forcing more bonding and upfront, capitalization to prevent against that. But the reality is, we might still be left holding the bag because we just don't know what the costs will be. So what our bill tries to do is to hold those companies accountable for those costs in a responsible way by having Lands Commission proactively, with funding, go out and conduct that survey, that study of what the cost of decommissioning will be, and to balance that against their future revenues. Now, we had numbers from one of the two companies back of the envelope, but they told us $20 to $30 million a year in revenues from the one platform they operate, and they estimated their cost of decommissioning would be $20 to $30 million. Now, I don't know if that's reflective of all three platforms, but those are, and again, they're clearly back of the envelope numbers. We didn't get like a spreadsheet or anything like that. But if those are the numbers, first I'd point out that the costs here are not going to be at the level some people think. We're not talking about billions of dollars of give-outs to operators of these leases. We're talking about something much more modest than that. And we're talking about balancing that against the costs, but providing, again, significant discretion and flexibility to Lands Commission to determine, hey, what is fair here as far as the payout to the oil companies. So I'm not an expert. I can't tell you what it's going to cost to decommission. Executive Officer Lucchese can't tell you what it's going to cost right now. But what we're hoping to do is empower the staff of Lands Commission to have that information, to use that in a structured negotiation with the operators in a way that's responsible to taxpayers. And again, the point I'd emphasize is it's much better than the status quo, where the likelihood is these thinly capitalized companies, the majors have all walked away, as we know. These thinly capitalized companies are likely to walk away in the future once they've drained these things dry and leave the taxpayer holding the bag again. So at least this approach holds those operators accountable, reflects the actual cost of decommissioning to some degree. And so I think it's actually the fiscally responsible approach that is best for California taxpayers.
Okay. Thank you. We heard Robert Byrd telling us this morning or this afternoon, that the cost of these and just the reality of logistics would make it impossible. But yet, as was pointed out, there's, don't ever say never. I think, Catherine, you said that. Because things change. We're doing stuff now we never dreamed we'd be doing 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And so...
but I think what we want to avoid is a situation where the taxpayer is paying out $500 million for decommissioning while also giving them the payout. I mean, that's the problematic approach where they just drain it dry. And I guess the other thing I'd point out is and perhaps Catherine might disagree with me, but the more I understand about these platforms, the reality is we've not had a new platform release since, I believe, 1982. And so what has happened is that there's just been an increasing disinvestment in the infrastructure here. And so some of the problems we saw with the beta amplify problem or spill, they're not unexpected. I mean, the sensors may not work, and I don't know all the details to the extent that you do, but it is a ticking time bomb because there's just a disincentive with declining oil stocks to invest in these things. So I think it is appropriate to try to end these leases as quickly as possible in a way that is responsibly decommissioning them, in a way that is fair and does not violate the Constitution, and that's what our approach tries to do.
Okay, thank you. Collaboration, it seems like this is a very complicated issue, and it's multi-layer, it's expensive, everything. Collaboration is what's going to kind of move the ball. And even your bill, even though it kind of terminates the leases, you're still all about collaboration. And so what do you see as a direction forward? You know, I heard a suggestion about maybe state lands or maybe Fish and Wildlife should to keep this on the front burner, maybe should develop an advisory committee to keep this thing going, and of citizens and professionals to keep that conversation going and kind of push it, because we heard a lot today that it's going to be the public that's going to push this, and certainly if we have more oil spills, that will push the public.
I hope we have no more oil spills.
I do too, obviously, but I don't see how we won't. I'm usually the optimist, but we've had 6 major oil spills since 1969, and you know, I'd like to think there aren't going to be any more, but we have degrading equipment on these, and so, you know, what do you have any?
Well, if we stop the drilling, then I
Well,
think then we'll
agreed.
end this. And it's not to be that guy, but stop the drilling and the spilling, and I think that's what we're trying to do here. But again, that we can only control the state waters. There's a significant piece in the federal waters.
But there's been a lot of decommissioning in the Texas Gulf and all over. But I keep hearing that California is totally unique and an anomaly because they're so deep, they're so big, and they've never been done. We heard today that 500 foot is the largest record setter of a platform that's been removed. And so, and ours are 1,200 feet, our 2 deepest ones. So I think California, even though we have 3, I think the country, the federal government's looking at leadership from California on how do we handle these, because it's not the platforms that are in the Texas Gulf.
I think that's right, and I think you know, as Dave said when he was Senator Min said, as he was outlining his legislative approach, I think the goal, and I think a very realistic goal, is that if we can demonstrate a successful approach here in California, then that can then serve as a playbook for what needs to happen across federal waters. And I think you asked about collaboration, and I think, as I even said in my opening remarks, I think, or at some point, you know, I think figuring out a way to align interests and incentives, I think, is always important. And I think, at least in my view, when we're talking about this problem, and I'm curious, Catherine, I want to get your reaction to this, but so I've said this to other folks on, you know, in the industry side. The reality is that every time there is an oil spill or is a disaster, and that becomes front page news, I think that does then raise the alarm and, you know, raise the volume, not just for decommissioning offshore stuff, but decommissioning stuff everywhere. So if I was an oil exec, I would be saying, you know what, we really need to get rid of those offshore things. Like, they're creating this much value for us and creating this much risk. And I feel like it's sort of it's similar to what it's doing for us as a state. And I guess my question would be, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but you know, what can we? But as long as we're here, but you know, what can and should we do to bring industry to the table on this that we're not already doing? Because as you said, I mean, I know Dave is collaborative. I want to be collaborative. I think this space in particular, but I think also just kind of California politics in general, is a place where there's a lot of the times, you know, people don't assume positive intent, and they don't assume and it makes it hard to build trust, which I think, whether we're talking about this issue or anything else, is important for us to solve like the thorniest and toughest problems we have. So I would love any reactions you have, or any things that you would like to see California policymakers do that you think could move the needle on this goal.
No, I really, that's an excellent question. I appreciate it, because it's hard, as you know, in our industry, the issue of how important it is to build trust and be collaborative and work together, it's really difficult because every day we're villainized, right? And I can tell you, my whole background's environmental, and I've been working with this industry for 40 years. And it's hard when you want to come to the table and work together when you're in that kind of an atmosphere. It's really difficult because solving problems is in these companies' DNA. That's who they are. That's what they do. I mean, you probably see that in what you're doing with Holly and everything else. I mean, they love solving problems. So I think to enter real partnerships where we recognize we might not agree on everything, but we're going to agree on enough to move the ball forward here. And if we can do that collaboratively without, kind of villainizing, I think that would go a long way, because it's really tough to talk about. I mean, we may not share the same politics, but we do share a common energy future that I think we all buy into, and I think we all understand the threat of climate change and that we've got to deal with it. So how do you build that trust, and how do you stay at the table and say, look, we want to solve the problem with you? Because if we do it intentionally and not accidentally, I think we have a really good chance of figuring this out. I really do. But it is, I understand your comment, Assemblywoman, of decoupling onshore and offshore, but it is also difficult when you're in the industry where this state doesn't want to do either. And yet we produce this crude oil onshore, in the most environmentally sensitive way we possibly can. And I don't think an answer, and as legislators, I think it's difficult for you to answer the question, how do you support more foreign imports when you can be doing it in your backyard? Now, I'm not saying offshore, but on the onshore side, it's really tough, because this state is not about reducing emissions, it's about reducing oil, period. I mean, the governor's very clear on his desires to phase out oil production in this state. And my assertion is that you cannot get from A to B without the oil and gas industry. Not on climate change, not on reduction of emissions, not on technology, not on, how do you decommission offshore platforms? If not us, then who? I could make the same argument on carbon capture sequestration. That would be a whole nother day conference. I've been pushing that since 2006 when I was on the Blue Ribbon Committee on that one, and we still haven't done one. And, so I think if we're going to be serious about collaboration, let's be serious about collaboration, and let's get together and figure it out, and not talk about, Senator, with all due respect, when I hear terms like unilateral termination, it does kind of get my hair going up a little bit on my neck. But now if it's in the context, the voluntary relinquishment, I get that part. So I think we are working on that, and I appreciate your openness to meet and work on that, and I think we can get there. But it's hard because there's just this attitude about we're going to eliminate this. The very industry that's going to help us get from A to B, there's this desire to eliminate it, and it's frustrating. It's not like that in the rest of the world, let me tell you. So it's hard.
And if I could respond, there's a lot you said that I actually agree with, and I think I am new to the Senate. I've been there just a little over a year, and I would say the one thing that strikes me is that we are overly reliant on mandates in the state to try to reach our carbon emissions goals, which are aggressive, and we underinvest. And so if we really want to phase out fossil fuels and other sources of high carbon emissions, we really have to innovate, because we can't just reduce standard living and energy usage to the levels that we need. In the meantime, in that bridge, you're right, fossil fuels are the only answer until we can get to that 24/7 production, storage of energy. I understand storage is a big issue right now. So one of the things that I've been pushing for, and Assemblywoman Petrie-Norris as well, is more investment. We have had historic budget surpluses the last 2 years. And so I was pleased to see the governor this year actually start to push for more investment, whether it's direct R&D at the UCs, whether that's tax credits for green innovation companies that locate here in California, whether that's other types of sticks and carrots that can help. But until we get that price per kilowatt of green energy, renewable energy, and also have that consistency so that you're able to power your home at night when we don't have solar, things like that, we're not going to be able to displace fossil fuels. And so that is the reality we face. We should be treating policy differently. And I think demonizing companies or industries in the meantime is not the constructive approach. That being said, we do face a climate crisis, and we do need to start working to reducing carbon emissions, and fossil fuels are obviously a huge source of that. So I hear your points, and I agree with a lot of what you said, and I do think the state needs to revise its approach, and the governor, he's taking baby steps. I would have liked to see him like 10x what he did for some of the things he did on investment, but it's a start.
I will just add some additional perspective from an agency standpoint. We try to address collaboration and engagement on two different levels, and really this was lessons learned coming out of Platform Holly and Rincon Island, is getting into the communities, really being, as a government agency, not so stuck in the structure of public comment and response, but engaging more informally, understanding what the community's needs are, what the workers on these platforms and in the industry are dealing with, everything from craft services to the reservoir and drilling engineers, and getting and really receiving those perspectives very directly and informally. On the more structured perspective, and this kind of speaks to your question about how to keep this issue on the front burner, at least with the State Lands Commission, this isn't the same with all state agencies, but our commission is a public commission where all the decisions are made at a public meeting. And we have oil and gas issues on our agenda every single meeting. And in fact, our next meeting is next Tuesday. We're having, the commission will be deciding on the removal of the last shore zone piers, oil production shore zone piers project, and we're also doing a status update on the state of play for all offshore oil and gas leases, production leases and pipeline leases in state waters. So, and our commissioners are the Lieutenant Governor, State Controller, and the Director of Finance. And so policy makers and decision makers that are looking at the statewide interest as a whole, from not only an environmental perspective, an economic perspective, land use perspective, all of the consideration and factors that go into these big decisions and these complex problems.
Thank you. One last question, and maybe we can cut this a little short. I know Assemblywoman has to go. What comes to your mind if we say, okay, how do we get from this day where we've had people from different perspectives, we've shared our perspectives, but we've listened and we've given ours, and it's been a collaborative day. And how do you suggest the environmental community or NGOs or community-based, how could we help policymakers, agency heads, and what can we do? How would you recommend we go forward? Anyone?
I think that so many of the folks in this room do a tremendous job of advocacy and of outreach and of working with legislators like Senator Min and I and folks all across the state. And I think that on this issue specifically, Garry, I regard you particularly as someone who's an expert on this. When I have questions about this, you are someone that I naturally call. And I think that one way that we can maybe formalize some of that input is, and I've been sort of reflecting about, what do I do with our select committee on the Orange County oil spill, and do we turn that into part of my accountability and administrative review committee, where we do maybe every 6 months we do a check-in and a review. As you said, make sure that once stuff is out of the headlines, we kind of keep making progress. And so I think building in that kind of a regular schedule and a regular opportunity where interested parties know that that's coming up and can be part of that, can see those updates from our state agencies, can provide input as stakeholders. I think kind of building that drumbeat together could be very powerful to ensure that we continue to make progress on an issue that I think we all acknowledge is really complex, really tough, but incredibly, incredibly important for California.
Thank you. Anybody else have any?
I mean, as a fellow elected official, I think just hearing from you, events like this are very important for increasing awareness. many of you in this room I've never met before, and I, would encourage you. I'd love to talk with you afterwards, get to know you, and hear from you. And I think having our office hear from you, because we're in a silo, and we try to get out in our communities and reflect the values of our district, the values of our constituents. But if we don't hear from you, all we're hearing from is organized lobbies. It makes it a little bit tough to sort of put your finger on the pulse of our community. Now, I think on this one, I feel pretty clear that our community has a strong opinion, but I think on other environmental issues, on other issues around coastline, open space preservation, they're not always as clear cut. So I think that advocacy, that direct outreach to us, texting our offices, calling our offices, holding events like this, and then, I'll bring up the thing no one wants to talk about. Money matters in politics, and I learned that the hard way. It's unfortunate, but it is. When I have 1.1 million voters or 1.1 million residents I represent, about 700,000 voters, and to reach them, I can't just go out and knock on a bunch of doors and talk to folks. As much as I'd like to do that, I have to actually pay for TV and radio and mail and stuff like that. And so that money in politics, unfortunately, matters. So to the extent that groups like yourselves can get organized, that helps you increase your political power, not just with us, but with everybody in politics, and even at the municipal level. And so I'd say that is also important. Just get involved, get organized, get engaged, because I think we're losing this fight right now. Even though there's, particularly among young people, we're recognizing the importance of fighting the climate crisis, of protecting our pristine open spaces, particularly in places like Orange County, where we're so fortunate to have so much beautiful outdoor space. But it often feels like an uphill battle, because we know we have the numbers, but it often feels like our numbers are disjointed and not necessarily working concertedly towards political action.
Okay. Thank you.
But not Garry, of course. And you guys here are all awesome.
I want to thank you, Assemblywoman, Catherine, Senator, and Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining us for the day and for joining us on this panel. We really appreciate it. And you'll be hearing from us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Garry.